Welcome. Settle into your bed, dim the lights, and let your body grow heavy and still. There is nothing to solve tonight, nothing to remember, nothing to do at all. Just a story, softly told, to carry you into sleep. Tonight, we travel back almost 2,000 years to a small vineyard on the slopes of a quiet, sleeping mountain. This is the Hush Historian. Close your eyes if you would like. I will take it from here. Felix woke before the birds did. It was the hour when the world still belonged to darkness, when even the dogs of Pompeii had not yet begun their restless barking. He lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet breathing beside him, to the small, steady breath of his daughter in the next room. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of the vineyard through the shutters, damp earth, and crushed leaves, and something sweeter underneath, the last of the season's grapes still clinging to the vine. He did not open his eyes right away. There was no reason to hurry into a day that had not yet arrived. When he finally rose, he moved slowly, careful not to wake Prima. 20 years of shared mornings had taught him exactly where the floorboards complained, and he stepped around them out of old habit rather than thought. Their home was small, 2 rooms in a narrow courtyard, walls painted a soft, faded red that had once been brighter. A single oil lamp still burned low near the doorway, its flame thin and patient. He passed his daughter's sleeping shape, Vibia, curled beneath a woolen blanket, one arm flung outward as though she had fallen asleep mid-gesture. He paused there just briefly before continuing on. Outside, the night was fading at its edges. Felix stood in the doorway and let his eyes adjust to the shapes around him, the low stone wall, the packed earth path, the dark rows of vines climbing the slope behind the house. Beyond them the mountain rose wide and calm, its peak lost somewhere in the last of the night's shadow. It had always been there, patient and unremarkable, more a part of the landscape than a presence. Farmers said its soil was the richest in all of Campania, and Felix believed them, because nothing he had ever grown elsewhere had tasted quite like this. He walked the path. He had walked 10,000 times before, past vines heavy with the last grapes of the season, their leaves silvered with dew. He had planted some of these rows himself, back when his hands were still unused to freedom, back when the land had felt like a gift too large to hold. A freedman does not often come to own a hillside like this one. He touched a cluster of grapes as he passed, not to inspect them, simply because his palm knew the shape of them, the way another man's hand might know the grain of a favorite tool. Below, in the direction of the town walls, the first threads of smoke had begun to rise from the ovens of Pompeii, thin and gray against a sky just beginning to soften from black to a deep, unhurried blue. Somewhere down there, a baker was already stacking loaves, a fisherman untying his boat from the shore, a merchant unbolting his shop for a day that had not yet properly begun. Felix could not see any of it from here. Not really, only imagine it, the way a man imagines a room he has stood in 1,000 times before. Before he began his work, he paused at the small shrine near the courtyard wall, a modest niche holding 2 painted figures, the household's lares, worn smooth by years of the same gesture. He did not pray with any great ceremony. It was simply what a morning required, the way washing his face required water. A quiet word, an offering of a single grape, a moment of stillness before the labor of the day. He had performed this same small ritual every morning for 20 years, and he saw no reason this particular morning should be any different from the ones before it. By the time he reached the highest row, the sun had begun to touch the ridge above the vineyard, spilling a low amber light across the leaves. It was Felix's favorite hour, quieter than dawn's dark stillness, before the heat of the day arrived to make the work heavier than it needed to be. He crouched beside a vine and checked the weight of a cluster in his palm, turning it slightly toward the light. Another few days, perhaps, before the last harvest. The grapes this year were heavy and sweet, and the soil, as always, had been generous. Behind him, smoke began to rise thin and pale from his own small chimney, Prima now awake and coaxing the morning fire back to life. He could hear her voice faintly, low and unhurried, speaking to Vibia in the particular tone mothers use before either of them is fully awake. He did not go back yet. There would be time enough for breakfast. Once the rows nearest the house had been checked, once he had walked the boundary of what was, in every way that mattered to him, the truest home he had ever known. The mountain stood behind him as it always did, unhurried, unremarkable, holding the pale color of early morning against a sky now fully blue. Felix did not look at it for long. There was nothing in its shape that morning to suggest it deserved his attention any more than it had the morning before, or the 1,000 mornings before that. He turned back toward the house, toward the smell of bread and the sound of his daughter's small voice, and began the short walk home. By the time Felix reached the house, the sun had cleared the ridge entirely, and the smell of the morning fire had filled the small courtyard. Prima looked up from where she knelt beside the hearth, her hands dusted with flour, a strand of hair escaping the knot at the back of her neck. She did not ask where he had been. After 20 years, she already knew the same rose, the same shrine, the same quiet walk before the house was fully awake. She simply nodded toward the low table and told him to sit, that the porridge was nearly ready. Breakfast was simple, as it always was, a thick barley porridge sweetened faintly with a little honey, a heel of yesterday's bread, a few olives left from the autumn pressing. It was not a wealthy table, but it was a full one, and Felix had learned long ago that fullness mattered far more than variety. He ate slowly, watching the light move across the courtyard wall, listening to the small sounds of the house waking around him, a pot scraping, a door easing open, his daughter's feet padding softly across the tiled floor toward the smell of bread. Vibia arrived still half asleep, her hair loose and uncombed, rubbing one eye with the back of her hand. She was 8 years old enough to help with small tasks in the vineyard, young enough to still see the work as something closer to play. She climbed onto the bench beside her father without a word, leaning her small weight against his arm, and Felix let her sit there a moment before nudging a piece of bread toward her. Neither of them spoke. It was not the kind of morning that required conversation, only the quiet fact of being near one another. Tomorrow was the feast of Vulcan, and Prima had already begun planning the small offering they would leave, a modest fire in the courtyard, a few fish thrown into the flames as was the custom, an old habit nobody in the household questioned or fully understood any more. Vulcan was the god of the forge and of fire that could not be tamed, and every year the people of Pompeii lit their small fires and hoped in their quiet, practical way that the god would be satisfied enough to leave the rest of the year alone. Felix mentioned it only in passing, already thinking of the vines. He told Prima he intended to walk into town later, to see whether the price of last year's wine had settled, and to find out if Neas, his neighbor 2 vineyards over, had begun his own harvest yet. Prima said she would need bread from the baker near the forum, and a length of wool she had ordered from a weaver whose name she never quite remembered. These were the small transactions of an ordinary day, unremarkable in every way, the kind of day that asked nothing of anyone beyond showing up for it. Vibia asked if she could come with him to check the highest row again, the one where the grapes were sweetest, and Felix said perhaps later, once the sun was higher and the dew had burned away. She accepted this the way children accept most delays, without real disappointment, already moving on to some other small question, whether the goat had been milked yet, whether they might visit Neas's daughter later in the week. Felix answered what he could, and let the rest drift past him, unanswered, the way a father learns to let a child's endless curiosity simply exist. Prima, meanwhile, had already turned to her own morning's work, carding wool by the courtyard wall, her hands moving in the same practiced rhythm they always did. She hummed faintly under her breath, an old tune with no particular name, the kind of sound a house makes when nothing is wrong in it. Felix watched her for a moment, the light catching the loose strands of her hair, and felt, not for the first time, a quiet and unremarkable gratitude for the shape his life had taken. When breakfast was finished, he rose, brushed the crumbs from his tunic, and told Vibia to help her mother with the wool before he returned. She groaned softly, the way children do at any task resembling work, but did not argue. Felix paused at the doorway, looking back once at the small scene behind him, his wife at her carding, his daughter reluctantly obeying, the fire low and steady in its hearth. Then he stepped out into the full light of morning and began the walk toward town. The road into Pompeii ran along the edge of the vineyards before dropping toward the town walls, worn smooth by centuries of cartwheels and sandaled feet. Felix walked it without hurry, past low stone boundary markers, past a shepherd moving a small flock toward pasture, past the crumbling corner of a wall still unrepaired since the earthquake some years before, ivy now claiming what mortar once held. The town always looked slightly different from this angle in the morning, softer somehow, its rooftops catching the early light in uneven patches of red and gold. Behind him, the mountain remained exactly where it always was, silent, distant, and entirely unremarkable. The path toward Neas's land ran alongside his own for a short stretch before curving downhill, and Felix found the old man already among his vines, moving slower than he used to, but still moving. Neas straightened when he saw him, one hand pressed briefly to his lower back, and called out the same greeting he had used every harvest season for as long as Felix could remember, asking whether the mountain soil had been kind this year, as though the answer might ever be anything but yes. They spoke only briefly, the way men do when there is work waiting on both sides of a conversation. Neas said his own harvest would begin in 3 days, perhaps 4, depending on the heat. He complained, without much conviction, about his knees, about the price the merchants were offering this season, about a grandson who preferred fishing to farming. Felix listened and answered, where an answer was expected, and the two men parted the way they always did, without ceremony, already turning back to their separate rows. The road widened as it approached the town walls, joining with paths from other farms and small holdings, until Felix walked among a loose gathering of neighbors and strangers, all moving toward the same gate. Pompeii's walls rose ahead of him, old stone patched here and there with newer brick, a reminder of the earthquake some years back that had cracked more of the town than anyone liked to admit. Through the gate, the noise of the town began to reach him before its shapes did. Voices, cartwheels, a hammer striking stone somewhere unseen. Inside the walls, the streets narrowed into their familiar grooves, deep ruts worn by generations of cart traffic, stepping stones set across for crossing when the gutters ran with water. Felix passed a bakery already thick with the smell of the day's second batch, then the open front of Amara's small food counter, where jars of oil and stew were set into the marble countertop, steam still rising faintly from one of them despite the morning warmth. Amara caught his eye and offered the same tired, friendly nod she gave everyone who passed at this hour. The Forum, when he reached it, was already busy in its unhurried way, merchants arranging their stalls, a group of men discussing something near the steps of the temple, a stray dog moving between legs in search of dropped food. Felix had never found the Forum particularly beautiful, not the way visitors sometimes described it, but he understood, in his own quiet way, why people spoke of the town with a certain pride. It was solid. It had stood, more or less unchanged, for longer than anyone currently walking through it had been alive. Near the basilica, two men stood on a wooden scaffold, repainting a wall that had cracked during the earthquake years before, restoring a faded fresco of a garden scene, vines and birds rendered in careful, patient strokes. Felix paused a moment to watch them work, the way he sometimes paused to watch anyone doing careful, unhurried labor. The town had spent years repairing itself in small pieces like this, one wall at a time, in no particular rush, as though it had already decided it had all the time it needed. He found the wool merchant Prima had mentioned, a narrow shop front near the edge of the Forum, and arranged for the length of fabric to be delivered before the week's end. The merchant, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, asked after the vineyard, and Felix told him the harvest looked to be a good one, better than last year, though not so good as the year Vibia was born, which had been, by every account, an unusually generous season. On his way back toward the gate, he stopped once more at Amara's counter, more out of habit than hunger, and bought a small honeyed pastry to bring home for Vibia. Amara wrapped it in a scrap of cloth without being asked, the way she always did, and told him, as she told most of her regular customers, that the fish soup that day was particularly good, though she suspected he had somewhere else to be. He left the town the way he had entered it, unhurried, the noise fading gradually behind him as the road climbed back toward the vineyards. Behind the walls, the mountain remained where it always stood, visible now over the rooftops, calm and pale against the mid-morning sky. Felix did not think about it at all as he walked. There was nothing about that morning to suggest he should. Back at the vineyard, the sun now fully risen, Felix set aside the small errands of the morning and returned to the only work that had ever truly mattered to him. The vines needed checking row by row, cluster by cluster, a slow and repetitive task that had never once felt tedious to him, not in 20 years. He moved down the first row with the easy rhythm of long habit, lifting leaves, testing weight, occasionally pinching free, a grape gone soft too early. He had not always owned land like this. For the first half of his life these hands had belonged, in the eyes of the law of nothing else, but to another man, a merchant in Herculaneum, who had treated him neither cruelly nor kindly, simply as a tool that occasionally required feeding. Felix rarely spoke of those years, not out of shame, but because they felt, now, like they belonged to someone else entirely, a younger man wearing his same face. His freedom had come the ordinary way such things came, not through any dramatic act, but through years of quiet, accumulated trust, a master growing old and generous in the particular way old men sometimes become when they have nothing left to prove. Felix had been given his manumission on an unremarkable afternoon, with little more ceremony than a signed document and a brief, awkward embrace, and had walked away from that house with almost nothing, except for the first time, himself. It had taken years after that to save enough for even this modest hillside, a parcel of volcanic soil that other farmers had considered too steep, too far from the main roads, not worth the effort. Felix had seen it differently. He remembered walking this same ground as a much younger, poorer man, running his hand over soil so dark and rich it seemed to hold warmth of its own, and deciding, with the particular stubbornness of someone who has finally been given a choice, that this would be his. The first years had been hard in ways he rarely described to Vibia, who knew her father only as a settled, unhurried man tending an established vineyard. She did not know about the seasons he had gone without a proper harvest, the loans he had taken from Aeneas's father, long since repaid, the nights he had slept among the vines rather than walk the distance home in the dark. She knew only the version of him that existed now, and Felix found he preferred it that way. He paused near the center of the vineyard, at a vine slightly older and thicker than the others, one of the first he had planted with his own hands when the land was still more promise than product. He touched its trunk the way a man might touch the shoulder of an old friend, without particular sentiment, simply acknowledging a long shared history. This vine had outlived 2 poor harvests and 1 particularly harsh winter, and Felix had always privately believed it would outlive him as well. The work continued in this way for the better part of the morning, unremarkable and steady, the sun climbing higher, the shade beneath the vines growing shorter. Felix thought, as he often did during these hours, about what would come of all this once he was gone, whether Vibia would want it, whether she would understand the particular satisfaction of owning something built entirely from one's own patience. It was not a worry exactly, more a quiet, recurring question he allowed himself to turn over without needing an answer. A little past midday, he noticed the soil near the lowest row felt strange underfoot, slightly warmer than the rest, though he thought little of it at the time. The ground around Vesuvius had always run warm in patches, a peculiarity of the volcanic earth that made the grapes taste the way they did, rich and dark and faintly smoky. Felix had grown up hearing this explained as a gift from the mountain, and he had never had reason to think of it as anything else. By the time he straightened from the last row, his back aching pleasantly in the way honest labor tends to ache, the sun stood almost directly overhead. He wiped his hands on his tunic and looked back down the length of the vineyard he had built from almost nothing, rows upon rows of vines heavy with the last fruit of the season, and felt, as he did most days at this hour, a quiet and complete satisfaction that asked for nothing more than what it already had. When the sun reached its highest point, Felix made his way back down toward the house, where Vibia was already waiting at the edge of the vineyard with a small basket balanced against her hip, sent by her mother to bring him bread, cheese, and a handful of dried figs. She had clearly hurried, her sandals dusty, one strap coming loose, and she presented the basket with the particular pride children reserve for tasks they consider important. They sat together in the shade of a fig tree at the vineyard's edge, the only real shade for some distance, its broad leaves filtering the harsh midday light into something softer and more bearable. Vibia ate quickly, the way children do, more interested in talking than in the food itself, describing at length a lizard she had found near the courtyard wall that morning, its exact color, the way it had frozen when she approached, the name she had already decided to give it. Felix listened without needing to say much, offering the occasional question to keep the story moving, content simply to sit in the shade with his daughter's voice filling the quiet space around them. It was, he thought, one of the few luxuries his kind of life allowed, this unhurried middle hour, work already half finished, more work still ahead, but for now, only bread, shade, and a child's small, endless observations about the world. Somewhere below, though he could not see it from here, Felix imagined the town continuing through its own midday rhythms, much as it always did. Restitutus, the fisherman who sold to Amara most mornings, would be mending nets in whatever shade he could find near the shore. The glassblower near the forum would have paused his furnace for the worst of the heat. Pompeii did not stop at midday so much as it slowed, the way anything sensible slows when the sun insists on it. Vibia finished her food and lay back against the grass, staring up through the fig leaves at the fractured light above her, asking, in the unhurried way children ask questions that have no urgency behind them, whether the vines ever got tired of growing in the same place every year. Felix considered this longer than the question perhaps required, and told her that he did not think the vines minded at all, that some things were better for staying exactly where they were planted. He did not tell her that this had always felt to him like the truest thing he believed, not just about vines, but about the life he had built here, about the particular stubbornness of choosing one hillside and refusing to imagine any other. Vibio would not have understood the weight behind such a small statement, not yet, and Felix saw no reason to burden an ordinary afternoon with the kind of thought better suited to older, quieter hours. A light breeze moved through the vineyard as they rested, stirring the leaves overhead, carrying with it the faint mineral smell that always seemed to rise from the mountain soil on the warmest part of the day. Felix noticed it only distantly, the way a person notices any smell they have known their entire life, present but unremarkable, folded into the general texture of an afternoon that asked nothing more of him than rest. Eventually, Vibia grew restless again, as children do, and wandered a short distance to inspect an anthill near the base of the fig tree, narrating its residents' activities to no one in particular. Felix watched her for a while, then closed his eyes briefly against the light, allowing himself the small, guilty pleasure of doing nothing at all for a few minutes longer than the day strictly required. When he finally rose, brushing bits of grass from his tunic, the worst heat of the day had already begun to soften, the light shifting toward the longer, gentler hours of afternoon. He gathered the empty basket, took his daughter's hand, and together they made their way back toward the house, leaving the fig tree's shade behind them, the vineyard settling back into its familiar quiet. The afternoon settled into its familiar rhythm, Felix returning to the lower rows while Vibia trailed behind him, half helping, half playing, filling a small basket with grapes that had fallen loose onto the soil. The heat had softened slightly from its midday peak, and the work felt easier for it, the kind of steady, unremarkable labor that filled most of his afternoons this time of year. It was Vibia who noticed first, though she did not think much of it, that the well near the boundary wall tasted strange when she stopped to drink from it, faintly bitter, almost metallic. She mentioned it to her father only in passing, the way children mention most things, without any real concern behind the words, and Felix told her it was likely nothing, that wells sometimes tasted odd this late in a dry season. A short while later, the ground beneath them trembled faintly, barely more than a shiver, gone almost as soon as it began. Felix paused, one hand resting against a vine post, waiting to see if it would come again. It did not. Tremors were not unusual in this part of Campania, not since the great earthquake years before, and most people had long since stopped treating the small ones as anything worth mentioning. The dog belonging to the household 2 vineyards over began barking without any obvious cause, a thin, persistent sound carrying faintly across the still afternoon air. Felix noted it the way he noted most background sounds of the countryside, present but unremarkable, one small detail among the 100 small details that made up any ordinary day of outdoor labor. Overhead, a loose formation of birds shifted direction more abruptly than birds usually did, wheeling once around the slope before continuing on toward the sea. Vibia looked up and pointed, delighted by the sudden movement, asking her father why they had turned like that. Felix said he did not know. Birds did as birds pleased, and returned his attention to the vine in front of him. He crouched to inspect a cluster near the base of an older vine, and found the soil slightly warmer there than it had been that morning, warmer even than usual for this part of the hillside. He pressed his palm flat against the earth for a moment, feeling it, then decided it was simply the accumulated heat of the day working its way down, nothing more unusual than that. Prima called from the direction of the house, her voice carrying easily across the quiet vineyard, asking whether Vibia had finished filling her basket, whether Felix intended to check the lower boundary before the light began to fade. He answered that he would, in time, and continued along the row unhurried, the small strange details of the afternoon already fading from his attention the way small details always did. The mountain, when he glanced toward it out of habit rather than concern, looked exactly as it always looked, wide and calm against a sky beginning its slow drift toward evening color. If anything had changed about it, Felix could not have named what, and he did not spend long looking, his attention already returning to the vine in front of him, to the ordinary demands of an ordinary afternoon. Vibia grew tired of the basket work before the row was finished, and wandered instead toward a patch of wildflowers near the boundary wall, humming some tune of her own invention. Felix let her go without comment, the vineyard quiet again except for the soft sound of leaves stirring, the distant bark finally settling, the afternoon continuing along its familiar, unremarkable path. By mid-afternoon, the tremor from earlier returned, stronger this time, enough to rattle the clay jars along the courtyard wall and send Prima's hand instinctively toward the doorframe. It passed within a few heartbeats, as the first one had, but it left behind a small residue of attention that had not been there before, a faint awareness that something somewhere was different from an ordinary day. Gnaeus appeared at the boundary between their two vineyards not long after, moving faster than his knees usually allowed, asking Felix if he had felt it too, if he thought it worth mentioning to anyone. Felix said he had felt it, and that he did not know who such a thing would even be mentioned to. Tremors were the mountain's business, not the business of magistrates or priests, and neither man could think of anyone whose job it was to answer for the ground itself. A hairline crack appeared along the inside wall of the storage room where Felix kept his oldest amphorae, thin as a hair, easy to miss unless a person happened to be looking directly at that patch of plaster in the right light. Felix noticed it while fetching a jar, ran his thumb along it once, and decided it was nothing more than the ordinary settling any old wall eventually developed. Prima, setting bread to rise in the kitchen, admitted to Felix in a quiet moment that the tremors made her uneasy in a way she could not quite explain, not fear exactly, more a small, persistent unsettledness, the way a held breath feels before it is finally released. Felix told her gently that the ground had shaken before and always settled again, that there was no reason to believe this time would be any different. Outside, the animal seemed to agree with Prima more than with Felix. The goat pulled harder than usual against its tether, and a pair of hens refused to settle into their usual corner of the yard, wandering instead toward the open gate, as though some part of them preferred to be elsewhere. Vibia found this more amusing than troubling, chasing the hens back with the delighted seriousness children bring to any small chore turned game. Felix returned briefly to the vineyard in the last hour of usable daylight, walking the rows one final time out of habit rather than necessity, checking nothing in particular, simply moving through the space, the way a man moves through a room he loves without needing a reason. The vines looked exactly as they had that morning, heavy, patient, indifferent to whatever small uncertainty had settled over the humans tending them. He noticed, without much alarm, that the well-water Vibia had complained of earlier did taste faintly different to him as well when he stopped to drink. Not unpleasant, simply unfamiliar, carrying a mineral edge he could not place. He drank it anyway, the way a person drinks water. They have relied on their entire life without serious consideration of an alternative. As the light began its slow amber decline toward evening, Felix found himself glancing at the mountain more often than usual, not out of any specific concern, but the way a person's eyes are drawn, almost against their will, toward the one thing in a landscape that has recently, however slightly, become unfamiliar. It still looked the same. He told himself this several times, as though repetition might settle the small unease Prima had named earlier. By the time he turned back toward the house for the evening, the tremors had not returned, and the strange animal behavior had mostly resolved itself into ordinary evening restlessness. Felix decided, as he walked the familiar path home in the softening light, that whatever this day had briefly threatened to become, it had, in the end, settled back into something closer to the ordinary shape of every other evening before it. Dinner came earlier than usual that evening, though nobody in the household could have said exactly why, only that the day had felt long in a way that made the ordinary hour of eating seem, without discussion, worth moving forward. Prima set out a simple meal: bread, a thick stew of beans and vegetables, a small portion of salted fish saved from the market days before. They ate together in the courtyard rather than indoors, the evening air pleasant after the day's heat, the first stars beginning their slow appearance above the vineyard's dark silhouette. Vibia recounted, for the second time that day, the story of the lizard she had found that morning, embellishing it slightly further with each telling, and neither of her parents corrected the growing exaggerations. Felix found himself unusually quiet through the meal, not from any particular worry, but from the pleasant exhaustion of a full day's labor settling into his limbs. He watched his wife and daughter across the small table, the lamplight catching the edges of their faces, and felt the same quiet gratitude he had felt that morning, unchanged by anything the day had briefly threatened. Vibia asked, between bites of bread, whether the shaking earlier meant the mountain was angry, a question children sometimes ask with more insight than they intend. Felix told her the mountain was not angry, that mountains did not feel anger any more than they felt kindness, that the ground simply shifted sometimes, the way anything old and heavy occasionally shifted, without meaning or intention behind it. Prima added little to this explanation, though Felix caught her glancing once toward the darkening shape of Vesuvius beyond the courtyard wall, her expression unreadable in the low light. She said nothing more about her earlier unease, and Felix did not raise it again, both of them content to let the ordinary comfort of the meal replace whatever small uncertainty had passed between them that afternoon. After the meal, Vibia was permitted, as a rare treat, to stay outside a little longer than usual, chasing the last of the evening light with the same restless energy she had chased the hens with earlier. Felix watched her from the doorway, arms crossed, feeling the particular tiredness that comes only from a day spent almost entirely outdoors, a tiredness he had always privately considered one of the better kinds available to a man. Prima began clearing the simple dishes, humming again the same wordless tune from that morning, and Felix found himself, not for the first time, marveling quietly at how little his life required to feel complete: a full table, a healthy daughter, a wife who hummed while she worked, a vineyard that had, against considerable odds, become entirely his own. The mountain, visible now only as a darker shape against a darkening sky, gave no further sign of the small disturbances it had offered earlier. Felix allowed himself one last glance toward it, before calling Vibia inside for the night, and found, in that glance, nothing to suggest that tomorrow would ask anything different of him than today had. The household settled slowly toward sleep as it always did, lamps extinguished one by one, small sounds of the day fading into the deeper quiet of night. Felix lay beside Prima in the dark, listening to the familiar rhythm of his daughter's breathing through the thin wall, and let his own eyes close without any particular thought beyond the ordinary comfortable expectation of another day, very much like this one. Morning arrived quietly, unremarkably, the household waking to the same routines that had governed every morning before it. If anyone in the house still carried yesterday's small unease, it did not show itself in the ordinary business of rising, dressing, and beginning the day's first small tasks. Felix walked his usual path to the shrine, offered his usual quiet word, and returned to the vines much as he always did. It was closer to midday when the sound came, low and distant at first, more felt than heard, a deep pressure in the chest before it registered fully as noise. Felix straightened from the row he had been working and looked toward the mountain out of pure instinct, the way anyone looks toward the source of an unfamiliar sound, even before understanding what they are looking for. Others in the vineyard had felt it too. Gnaeus appeared at the boundary wall again, slower this time, his expression harder to read than it had been the day before. Neither man spoke immediately. They simply stood together, looking in the same direction, two farmers whose entire understanding of the mountain had, until this moment, never required them to look at it this closely. Down in the town, though Felix could not see it from where he stood, similar small gatherings were likely forming in the forum, along the docks, outside the public baths, ordinary people pausing their ordinary tasks to glance upward, exchanging the same unspoken question without quite finding the words to ask it aloud. Pompeii did not panic. It simply paused, briefly, the way a room pauses when a door creaks somewhere unseen. Prima came to the edge of the courtyard, one hand shading her eyes, and called to ask if Felix had heard it too. He told her he had, and that he did not know what it meant any more than she did. Vibia, standing beside her mother, seemed more curious than afraid, tugging at Prima's sleeve to ask whether they might walk up the hill to see the mountain better. Felix considered briefly walking farther up the slope himself, toward the higher vineyards where the view opened more fully toward the peak. He decided against it, telling himself there was still work to finish, that whatever had made that sound would likely settle the way the tremors had settled, without requiring any particular response from a man who grew grapes for a living. The sound did not repeat immediately, and the vineyard slowly resumed its ordinary quiet, birds returning to their usual movement, the goat calming after its brief startled pulling at its tether. Gnaeus remained a while longer before returning to his own rows, remarking only that it had been some time since the mountain had made a sound quite like that one, though he could not say how long exactly, or what it had meant the last time either. Felix returned to his work with the deliberate, unhurried attention of a man choosing not to dwell on something he could not explain. The grapes still needed checking. The season's harvest still approached regardless of what sounds the mountain chose to make, and there was, in the end, very little else. A vineyard demanded of him beyond continued patient attention. By early afternoon, the strange quiet of the morning had mostly resolved itself back into ordinary rhythm, though Felix noticed, without quite admitting it to himself, that he glanced toward the mountain more often than he had the day before, each time finding it exactly as it always looked, patient, wide, and for now, silent again. It happened without warning, though later Felix would spend considerable time trying to recall some sign he had missed, some final moment of stillness before everything changed. He was crouched among the vines, testing the last unripe cluster of the season, when the ground beneath him gave a single hard lurch, throwing him sideways against the nearest post. The sound that followed was unlike anything he had heard the day before, a deep, tearing roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once, rolling across the vineyard and down toward the town below. Felix pushed himself upright, one hand still braced against the vine post, and turned toward the mountain, already knowing, before he fully looked, that something had irreversibly changed. A column of darkness had begun rising from the peak, impossibly tall, widening as it climbed until it resembled, in a way that would later be described by those who survived to describe anything at all, the broad, spreading crown of a great pine tree, black and gray against the pale afternoon sky. It climbed without hurry, as though it had all the time in the world to reach whatever height it intended. Vivia's voice reached him from the direction of the house, not yet frightened, simply curious, calling to ask what the strange cloud was. Felix found he had no answer that would not frighten her further, and so he gave none at all, moving instead toward the house at a pace quicker than his usual walk, though still short of anything resembling panic. Prima met him at the courtyard gate, Vivia's hand held tightly in hers, both of them looking past him toward the column now spreading wide across the upper sky, its underside catching strange dark colors that had no clear name. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. There did not seem to be words suited to what stood above them. Around the vineyard, Felix could hear other households beginning to stir, doors opening, voices calling across boundary walls, a rising murmur of confusion that had not yet organized itself into fear. Aeneas's voice carried faintly from somewhere down the slope, though Felix could not make out the words, only the tone, uncertain, questioning, entirely without precedent to draw from. Felix made the decision without much deliberation that they would not run, not yet. The column, however strange, remained distant, rising from the peak far above them rather than descending toward the vineyard itself. He had lived beside this mountain his entire adult life, and some quiet, stubborn part of him still believed it capable of settling, the way the tremors had settled, the way the strange smells and warm soil had settled. He gathered his family into the courtyard instead, away from the open slope, and told them, with more confidence than he entirely felt, that they would wait and watch, that panic solved nothing. A calm household could not solve better. Prima did not argue, though her eyes returned again and again to the darkening sky above the mountain's peak. The column continued its slow, silent climb through the remainder of the afternoon, spreading wider at its crown, casting the first faint shadow of premature evening across a sky that should still have held hours of ordinary daylight. Felix stood at the edge of his courtyard, his family close beside him, and watched the mountain do something none of them had words for. The first flakes arrived without ceremony, pale gray and weightless, settling onto the courtyard stones the way the first snow of a distant northern winter might settle, though none of them had ever seen true snow, only heard travelers describe it. Vivia reached out one small hand to catch a flake, turning it over on her palm with the same curiosity she gave the lizard the morning before. Within the hour, the fall had thickened considerably, no longer a scattering of curious flakes, but a steady, accumulating layer that coated the courtyard, the vineyard beyond, the distant rooftops of the town, all of it slowly disappearing beneath the same pale, even coating. The air carried a fine, gritty texture that caught in the throat, and Felix found himself coughing softly, more from surprise than discomfort. Prima gathered what cloth she could find and fastened pieces of it loosely over her face, and Vibia's, an improvised protection against the thickening air, her movements quick but not yet frantic, the practiced efficiency of a woman accustomed to managing a household through whatever circumstances arrived at her door. Felix did the same, tying a strip of linen across his nose and mouth, the fabric already dulled gray within minutes. They moved inside as the fall continued, gathering in the small central room of the house, the shutters pulled closed against the strange thickening air outside. The light that filtered through the gaps had turned an odd muted amber, neither daylight nor dusk, something the household had no prior word to describe. Vibia sat close against her mother, quieter now, though still more curious than afraid. Outside, the ash continued its patient accumulation, softening the sharp edges of the world, muffling sound in the particular way heavy snowfall might, though this fall carried none of snow's promised coldness, only a fine, persistent gray warmth that settled over everything it touched. Felix listened through the closed shutters to the faint sound of it landing, an almost gentle sound, entirely at odds with what it represented. Somewhere beyond their walls, other households were surely making their own decisions, some gathering belongings for the road, others sheltering as Felix's family now sheltered, uncertain which choice offered the greater safety. He thought once of Gnaeus, of Amara's small counter in the forum, of Restitutus and his boats along the shore, and hoped, without any real way of knowing, that each of them had found some reasonable shelter of their own. Felix considered more seriously now whether they ought to leave, to take whatever they could carry, and move away from the mountain entirely. But the roads, he reasoned, would already be thick with others attempting the same thing, and the fall, however strange, had not yet turned violent, only heavy, only persistent. He told himself, again, that waiting remained the wiser choice, that the walls around them offered more protection than an open road would. Vibia grew tired as the afternoon wore on, the strange dim light and muffled quiet working on her the way any long, unusual day eventually works on a child, and she fell asleep eventually against her mother's side, her small breathing steady, despite everything continuing to fall outside their walls. Prima held her without moving, her own eyes fixed on nothing in particular, some middle distance where worry and stillness met. Felix sat near the shuttered window, listening to the ash continue its long, soft fall, feeling, beneath the fear he did not fully allow himself to name, a strange and stubborn thread of hope that this too might pass the way the tremors had passed. That morning might yet arrive to find the vineyard dusted gray, but otherwise unharmed. The way gardens sometimes survived a hard frost, no one expected them to survive. The strange amber light outside the shutters began, gradually, and then all at once to fail entirely, the afternoon collapsing into a darkness far deeper than any ordinary evening should have produced this early. Felix understood, without needing to open the shutters to confirm it, that whatever hung in the sky above them had finally blotted out the sun completely, turning midday into something closer to the deepest hour of night. He lit the single oil lamp they kept for emergencies, its small flame casting a modest, trembling light across the room, enough to see Prima's face, Vibia still sleeping against her side, the familiar shapes of their small household now made strange by the totality of the darkness surrounding them. Nobody spoke for a long while. There did not seem to be anything useful left to say. From somewhere beyond their walls, faint sounds began to reach them, carried strangely through the thick, ash-heavy air, voices calling to one another across distances. Felix could not judge. The particular tone of people trying to locate each other in darkness that had arrived far too suddenly for anyone to have prepared for it. He listened without moving, unable to make out words, only the shape of urgency behind them. Prima asked, quietly, whether he thought they had made the right choice in staying. Felix did not answer immediately. Turning the question over the way he turned over most difficult things, slowly, without hurry, even now. He told her, finally, that he did not know, that no choice available to them that day had carried any certainty behind it, only degrees of uncertain hope. The ash continued falling beyond their shuttered windows, audible now as a persistent whispering weight against the roof tiles, occasionally accompanied by a heavier thud that Felix chose not to examine too closely, some larger fragment finding its way down from whatever the mountain continued sending skyward. The house held. It had held through storms before, through the earthquake years earlier, and Felix chose in this moment to trust that history. Vibia stirred once, briefly, murmuring something unintelligible before settling back into sleep, and Prima adjusted the cloth around her daughter's small shoulders with the same unhurried tenderness she brought to every ordinary night, as though the darkness surrounding them were nothing more than an early and unusually thorough evening. Felix moved once to check the small storeroom, more out of restless need for motion than any real purpose, and found the crack in the wall from the day before slightly wider than he remembered it, though still nothing that suggested immediate danger. He returned to the main room without mentioning it, seeing no reason to add this small detail to whatever quiet fear already sat unspoken between them. The distant voices beyond their walls grew less frequent, as whatever time passed and that unnatural darkness continued to pass, though Felix could not have said whether this meant people had found safety, or simply that the ash itself had grown too thick for sound to carry as it once had. He preferred, in the absence of any way to know, to imagine the former. They remained together in the small circle of lamplight, the three of them, the household reduced to the single warm point inside a darkness that had swallowed everything beyond their walls. Felix reached for Prima's hand across the narrow space between them, and she took it without needing to be asked, both of them settling into the only thing left available to do, which was simply to wait, together, for whatever came next. At some point in the long, formless stretch of that darkness, Felix stopped trying to measure how much time had passed. The lamp's oil burned low, and he did not refill it, choosing instead to let the room settle into a gentler, dimmer glow, rather than risk it guttering out entirely later, when they might need it more. Vibia woke again, this time more fully, and asked in a small voice whether it was still today or already tomorrow. Felix told her he did not know, that the mountain had made its own kind of night, one that did not follow the ordinary rules of morning and evening. She accepted this answer, the way she accepted most things her father told her, without argument, curling closer against her mother's side. Prima began, quietly, to hum the same wordless tune she had hummed every morning of Vibia's life while carding wool, and Felix found something in the sound that steadied him more than he expected. The ordinary made suddenly, achingly precious simply by continuing to exist inside a day that had stopped resembling anything ordinary at all. He thought in the stillness of the vineyard beyond their walls, of the vines he had spent 20 years tending, now buried somewhere beneath a gray weight he could not see or measure. It did not feel, in this moment, like the loss he might have expected it to feel like. It felt smaller than the three of them sitting together in this narrow room, smaller than Prima's hand still folded into his. The sounds from beyond their walls had grown fainter still, the world outside reduced now to the steady, endless whisper of falling ash, and the occasional distant sound Felix chose not to name even to himself. He kept his attention instead on the small, warm space around them, on his daughter's breathing, on his wife's quiet humming, on the particular gift of having exactly the people he loved most within arm's reach. Vivia asked if they might tell a story, the way they sometimes did on ordinary nights before sleep, and Felix found himself agreeing before he had fully decided to, reaching for the same simple tale he had told her 100 times before, of a small bird who built her nest too close to the sea and had to decide, each season, whether to move it further inland. Vivia knew this story by memory, and corrected him twice regardless, and Felix let her. Prima's eyes, in the low lamplight, held something Felix recognized without needing her to name it, the same quiet acceptance he felt building slowly in his own chest. Not resignation exactly, but a kind of settling, the particular peace that sometimes arrives once every possible choice has already been made. He did not know in that narrow room whether morning waited for them on the other side of this darkness, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that the question mattered less than he might once have expected. What mattered was this room, this lamp, these two people breathing steadily beside him, the whole of everything he had ever wanted folded into a space no larger. The ash continued falling, patient and endless, beyond their sealed shutters, and inside, the small family remained exactly where they had chosen to be, together, quiet, and for now, still safe within the only shelter that had ever truly mattered to any of them. The lamp finally guttered out some time after Vivia had fallen back asleep, and Felix did not light another. There seemed little reason to, and some quiet part of him found the darkness easier now than he expected it to be, familiar in its own way, the same darkness that had once greeted him every morning before dawn, simply arriving now from an unexpected direction. The air inside the small room had grown heavier as the hours passed, though Felix noticed this the way he noticed most things now, at a slight remove, as though observing the day from just outside himself. He kept one arm around Prima, her head resting against his shoulder, and felt Vivia's small warmth pressed against her mother's other side, the three of them arranged exactly as they had been for what felt, by now, like a very long time. He thought, in these last quiet hours, mostly of ordinary things. The vine he had touched that morning, older and thicker than the rest, the particular way Prima's hair had escaped its knot while she knelt at the hearth. Vivia's basket, hurried and proud, delivered across a vineyard that had felt that morning entirely unremarkable. He found he did not want to think of anything larger than these small, complete moments. Prima's breathing had slowed beside him, steady and unhurried, and Felix matched his own to hers without deciding to, the way a person's body sometimes settles itself around another's without needing instruction. He could not have said, in that final stretch of darkness, whether he was afraid. Mostly he felt tired, in the deep, complete way a long day's honest labor had always left him. The sounds beyond their walls had gone almost entirely silent by now, the world outside reduced to the same patient, endless weight it had carried for hours. Felix found the silence, strangely, more peaceful than the earlier distant voices had been, as though the whole valley had finally agreed together to simply rest. He thought once more of the mountain, wide and calm for 20 years before this single unremarkable morning had asked something different of it. He held no anger toward it, only the same quiet acceptance Prima's eyes had carried earlier, the understanding that some things could not be reasoned with, only endured, or not endured, depending on factors no farmer's patience could ever have accounted for. Vivia shifted once against her mother, murmuring something too soft to catch, And Felix reached over to rest his hand briefly against his daughter's small back, feeling the same steady rise and fall he had felt every morning of her life, through the thin wall separating their rooms, before he ever rose to walk the vineyard alone in the dark. The room grew heavier still, the air thick and warm in a way that made even breathing feel like a slow, deliberate task, and Felix found his own eyes growing difficult to keep open, not from fear now, but from something closer to the ordinary, welcome heaviness of the end of any very long day. He closed his eyes there, in the dark, with his wife's breathing slow beside him, and his daughter's small warmth folded against them both, and let himself rest, finally, the way a man rests at the end of the truest, fullest day he has ever known, surrounded by exactly what he had spent his whole life building toward, and letting go at last, into a quiet that asked nothing further of him at all. Almost 2,000 years passed over that quiet hillside, seasons turning without witness, the mountain settling back into the same wide, patient calm it had held for centuries before that one unremarkable morning. The vineyard Felix had built with his own hands vanished beneath the ash entirely, along with the house, the courtyard shrine, the small road that had once led toward a town called Pompeii. When people finally returned to dig, carefully, patiently through the layers the mountain had left behind, they found the town remarkably whole beneath its gray blanket, streets and walls and paintings preserved in a stillness no ordinary passage of time could have granted them. Among the many things they uncovered, gently over years of careful work, were vineyards, their vines long since decayed, leaving only faint hollow spaces in the hardened ash where roots had once reached deep into the warm volcanic soil. Archaeologists learned eventually to pour soft plaster into these hollow spaces, the same patient technique used to reveal the shapes of people the mountain had taken that day, and in doing so, they brought back the outline of vines planted in careful, deliberate rows on a steep hillside many considered too difficult to farm, tended for reasons no document could fully explain, except perhaps the quiet stubbornness of someone who had once been given very little and had chosen to build something entirely his own. Nobody now remembers the name of the man who planted those vines, nor the name of the woman who hummed while she carded wool in a small courtyard nearby, nor the small girl who once chased hens across a yard that no longer exists in any shape she would recognize. Their names, like so many names from that ordinary morning, were never written down anywhere that survived. But the vines remained, in outline, in the patient hollow shapes the earth had kept for them, evidence of care taken over 20 quiet years by hands that believed, in their own unremarkable way, that some things were worth building slowly, worth tending long after any reasonable person might have stopped expecting a return. The mountain still stands today, wide and calm, exactly as it stood on every ordinary morning before that one, watched now by millions of visitors who climb its slopes to look down at the wide blue bay below, rarely thinking of the small, unremarkable lives that once filled the hillsides beneath their feet, tending vines, walking to market, humming quiet songs while the wool gathered slowly into thread. Somewhere in the reconstructed outline of a vineyard on that hillside, a modern visitor might stand today without knowing it, in almost exactly the spot where a man once paused each morning at a small courtyard shrine, offering a single grape and a quiet word before beginning the long, ordinary work of an entirely ordinary day. There is a particular kind of peace, perhaps, in being remembered not for anything dramatic, but simply for having tended something patiently, for having built a small, complete life out of nothing more than steady hands and 20 quiet years, and having loved, in the end, exactly the people closest to him, exactly as much as any of us hope to be loved, at the end of our own ordinary days. And so, the mountain keeps its long, patient watch still, over vineyards planted and replanted many times since, over a hillside that has forgotten a great many names, but has never entirely stopped holding, somewhere in its ash and soil, the quiet shape of a family who chose, until the very last hour available to them, simply to stay close together. Sleep well. This is the Hush Historian, and I will be here, softly, whenever you need me again.